Just before sunrise on a freezing March morning in 1998, 6 years after everyone laughed at him for buying 320 acres of flooded river-bottom land, Matthew Carter stood alone in waist-deep water, watching another year's crop disappear beneath the current while his neighbors quietly shook their heads from the county bridge because, by then, even the people who loved him had started wondering whether the bank should never have sold him the farm in the first place. Matthew didn't curse. He didn't cry. He simply bent down, scooped a handful of dark river silt into his palm, and smiled. To understand why a man would smile while watching his entire future disappear beneath floodwater, we have to go back to a cold Tuesday morning in February of 1992, when a bank auctioneer asked for the first bid on 320 acres nobody else wanted. Before anyone in Jefferson County laughed at Matthew Carter for buying 320 acres of flooded river-bottom land, before the bank auction that people would talk about for years, and long before the river tested every promise he had ever made, there was something almost everyone in the county agreed upon without ever needing to say it out loud. If you found yourself in trouble and Matthew happened to know about it, there was a good chance he would arrive before you had time to ask, because helping people had become such an ordinary part of his life that he rarely noticed he was doing anything unusual. People remembered small things about him far more often than big ones, because those were the moments that quietly revealed the kind of man he was. They remembered seeing him stop his truck to help an elderly neighbor whose hay wagon had slipped into a roadside ditch, spending nearly 2 hours pulling it free before continuing on to work without mentioning the delay to anyone. They remembered him repairing broken gates for widows who insisted they couldn't afford to pay, only to discover later that Matthew had quietly left before they even came back outside with coffee. They remembered winter mornings when he carried feed to neighbors battling illness, summer evenings when he stayed behind after everyone else had gone home, just to help a young family finish baling hay before the rain arrived, and countless ordinary days when people quietly stopped being surprised whenever Matthew appeared, because somewhere along the way, the entire county had accepted one simple truth. If Matthew knew you were carrying something too heavy, chances were you wouldn't be carrying it alone for very long. Emily smiled every morning as she packed Matthew's lunch because she already knew there was a good chance part of it would never come home. More than once he had quietly handed his sandwiches to someone stranded on the roadside, working through the afternoon with nothing more than a cup of coffee, because helping another person had simply mattered more to him than eating on time. Before he stepped out the door that morning, she brushed a little dust from his jacket, slipped the lunch pail into his hand, and gently reminded him not to forget to eat this time. Matthew laughed, kissed her on the forehead, promised he would try, and they both smiled, because neither of them believed that promise for a second. On the morning everything changed, Matthew left home carrying a worn leather folder containing the paperwork he had studied for weeks, but before he reached the courthouse he noticed 80-year-old Walter Jenkins standing beside his pickup, struggling to lift 2 heavy sacks of cattle feed into the truck bed, while dozens of people hurried past without slowing down because the bank auction was only minutes away. Matthew never looked at his watch. He simply pulled onto the shoulder, climbed out, lifted the sacks as though he had nowhere else to be, and stayed long enough to make sure the old farmer wouldn't have to unload them alone later that afternoon. Walter smiled, shook his head, and chuckled that if Matthew kept stopping for everyone in the county, he was going to miss the biggest auction of his life. Matthew only smiled as he closed the truck's tailgate and quietly replied, "Then they'll have to wait another minute." Walter laughed softly because that answer sounded exactly like the man standing in front of him, then asked why Matthew was always helping everyone else when he had enough worries of his own. Matthew rested one hand on the truck door and repeated the words his father had spoken so often that they had become part of the way he lived. Heavy things are easier when two people carry them. Then he climbed back into his truck and continued toward the courthouse, completely unaware that before the morning was over, he would become the loneliest man in the room, raising the only hand willing to believe that 320 forgotten acres were still worth fighting for. By the winter of 1992, Matthew Carter had reached the age where most people in Jefferson County believed they already knew exactly who he was, not because he talked very much about himself, but because a small farming community has a way of quietly discovering a person's character through hundreds of ordinary moments that never make the newspaper. Long before anyone remembered him for the auction, people remembered him for the mornings he spent helping neighbors finish work that wasn't his, the evenings he quietly repaired things without being asked, and the countless times he somehow appeared wherever life had become just a little too heavy for someone else to carry alone. Matthew himself never thought of those moments as unusual because to him they simply looked like the life he had watched his father live. If a fence came down after a storm, you helped rebuild it. If an elderly neighbor couldn't lift feed into the truck anymore, you lifted it without waiting to be asked. If sickness kept someone from bringing in their hay before the rain, you stayed until the last bale was safely stacked, even if it meant finishing your own work after dark. He had grown up believing that a farming community survived for one simple reason. Sooner or later, every person became the one needing a helping hand. That quiet reputation followed him everywhere. Children waved whenever his old pickup rolled through town, because Matthew always slowed down long enough to wave back. Shop owners knew he never left the hardware store without asking whether anyone else needed supplies picked up along the way. Even the waitress at the little diner outside Pine Bluff had long since stopped asking whether he wanted a second slice of pie, because she already knew there was a good chance he would carry it out, wrapped in a napkin for someone who needed cheering up more than he did. Emily sometimes teased him about that habit on the drive home, and one evening she smiled before saying, "You know, one of these days you're actually going to keep dessert for yourself," causing Matthew to laugh softly with his eyes still on the road as he replied, "I've been saying that for years." And when Emily simply asked, "And?" he smiled again before answering, "I guess somebody always seems to need it first." Emily reached across the seat and gently squeezed his hand, because after all the years they had been married, she understood something Matthew never seemed to notice about himself. Kindness wasn't something he decided to do. It was simply the way he moved through the world. Perhaps that was why people trusted him with more than tools or tractors. They trusted him with worries they rarely shared with anyone else. More than once, Matthew found himself sitting on the tailgate of his pickup long after sunset, listening to a struggling farmer wonder how he was going to make another mortgage payment, or standing quietly beside an elderly widow whose husband had passed away only weeks earlier, while she tried to imagine managing the farm alone. Matthew never claimed to have the right answers, because he rarely believed people needed perfect advice, as much as they needed someone willing to stay beside them until tomorrow looked a little less frightening than it had the day before. Looking back, that may have been the greatest lesson Samuel Carter ever taught his son, although Matthew didn't fully understand where it came from until many years later. As a boy, he simply believed every father stopped to help strangers, every father quietly returned money to people who needed it more, and every father measured success by the number of burdens made lighter before the sun went down. It wasn't until adulthood that Matthew slowly realized the world didn't work that way for everyone, and by then those lessons had already become so deeply woven into the fabric of his own life that he couldn't have separated himself from them, even if he had tried. On the morning of the bank auction, dozens of people saw Matthew Carter pull over to help Walter Jenkins and thought they were watching one more ordinary act of kindness from a man who had built a lifetime out of small, unnoticed decisions. None of them realized they were also witnessing the shadow of another man whose hands had shaped Matthew's long before the county ever came to admire him. Because every time Matthew chose to stop instead of driving past, a piece of his father was quietly making the same decision all over again. As Matthew followed the other farmers into the courthouse that February morning, his eyes drifted almost unconsciously toward the large county map spread across the auctioneer's table, where the thick blue line of the Arkansas River curved across the bottom of the 320 acres everyone had already decided were worthless. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, that single blue line carried him backward through the years to a spring morning when he was no older than his own son, walking behind Samuel Carter with boots that were far too large and questions that seemed far too small. The river had spilled across the valley for nearly a week before finally beginning its slow retreat, leaving behind broken branches tangled in old fence lines, patches of standing water that reflected the morning sky, and fields that looked hopeless to almost everyone who drove past them. Yet, instead of waiting for the ground to dry like everyone else, Samuel woke Matthew before sunrise, handed him an old pair of rubber boots, and smiled when the sleepy boy asked where they were going, because his father simply answered that some lessons could only be learned while your feet were still muddy. Matthew remembered grumbling most of the way because he couldn't understand why anyone would choose to walk through flooded fields when there were chores waiting back at the barn. But Samuel never hurried him or laughed at his complaints. He simply kept walking at the same steady pace until they reached the edge of the receding water, where the river had left behind a long stretch of dark earth unlike anything covering the higher ground, then quietly knelt without saying a word. Young Matthew stood beside him, watching with growing curiosity as Samuel scooped a handful of the rich black soil into his weathered palm before gently pouring it into his son's smaller hands, and after allowing the boy a few moments to study it for himself, he asked what he saw. Matthew shrugged and answered honestly that it looked like nothing more than mud, causing Samuel to smile in that familiar way that always appeared whenever his son unknowingly stood one step away from discovering something important. Instead of correcting him, Samuel pointed toward a tiny oak sapling growing from a fresh mound of river silt only a few feet away, and asked whether Matthew remembered seeing it the year before. The boy looked closely, shook his head, and admitted that he had never noticed it, prompting Samuel to brush one finger gently across the bright green leaves before speaking so quietly that the river almost carried his words away. Most people spend their lives remembering what the river takes. He paused, just long enough for Matthew to look back toward the flooded field. But I've lived long enough to notice that it always leaves something behind for the people patient enough to look. Matthew looked down again at the dark soil resting in his hands before lifting his eyes toward the valley, and although he still didn't completely understand what his father meant, he noticed something he had missed earlier that morning because tiny wildflowers had already begun pushing through the fresh silt. Birds were gathering twigs the flood had carried downstream to build new nests, and the valley no longer seemed quite as empty as it had only a few minutes before. Samuel rested one hand gently on his son's shoulder before they began the long walk back toward the farmhouse, then smiled across the quiet valley and spoke words Matthew would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Land speaks slower than people, son." He looked once more at the river. "But it lies a whole lot less." As Matthew stood near the back of the courthouse in 1992, staring once again at the blue line winding across the auction map, he could almost feel the weight of that dark river soil resting in his childhood hands, and for just a moment The noisy room around him disappeared because the land everyone else saw as ruined still looked exactly the way his father had taught him to see it many years before. For several years after those mornings beside the river, life unfolded with the comforting rhythm Matthew had always believed would last forever, because every season seemed to arrive exactly when it was supposed to. Every harvest brought another opportunity to work beside his father, and every evening usually ended with the two of them sitting quietly on the old front porch, watching the sun disappear behind the Arkansas fields, while talking about everything from weather forecasts to broken machinery, although Matthew would later realize those conversations had rarely been about farming at all, because Samuel somehow found a way to turn ordinary days into lessons his son wouldn't fully understand until many years later. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice because Samuel never complained, never asked for sympathy, and never allowed himself the luxury of feeling sorry for his own body. The first sign arrived on an ordinary October afternoon while they were unloading 50-pound sacks of cattle feed into the barn, a job they had completed together more times than Matthew could possibly remember. Samuel bent to lift the first sack exactly as he always had, wrapped both hands around the rough burlap, and pulled upward. Yet the sack barely moved before he quietly stopped, took a slow breath, and tried again. Matthew froze, not because his father had failed, because his father had never failed before. Without saying a word, Matthew walked across the barn, gently slid his own hands beneath the sack, and lifted it onto his shoulder, as though he had simply decided to help. Samuel didn't argue. He didn't insist he could still manage it himself. He only looked at his son for a long moment, nodded once, and reached for the next lighter sack instead. And although neither of them spoke another word about what had just happened, something quietly changed inside Matthew that afternoon, because for the first time in his life, he understood that strength could leave a man so gradually he hardly noticed it until someone else was carrying what had once belonged to him. The weeks that followed became filled with moments so small that nobody outside the family would ever have considered them important, yet Matthew remembered every one of them because they slowly replaced the certainty he had always carried about his father. Samuel no longer crossed the entire farm without stopping to rest. The long walks beside the river became shorter than they used to be, and chores that had once taken a single morning quietly stretched across an entire day. Yet whenever Matthew suggested slowing down or taking time to rest, Samuel simply smiled the same gentle smile he had worn for years and found another way to keep moving. One evening, after finishing the last of the autumn harvest, Matthew stepped onto the front porch carrying 2 cups of coffee exactly as he had done hundreds of times before, only to stop halfway through the doorway because his father's rocking chair sat empty for the first time he could ever remember. The chair moved gently beneath the cool evening breeze, rocking back and forth with a slow creak that somehow made the silence feel even heavier. And after standing there for several moments, Matthew quietly looked through the front window where he saw Samuel asleep in his bedroom chair long before sunset, still wearing his work clothes because exhaustion had reached him before he ever made it back outside. Matthew carried both cups onto the porch anyway, placing one beside his own chair and the other beside his father's, before quietly sitting alone as darkness slowly settled across the fields and steam drifted from the untouched coffee until it finally grew cold. And although he never went inside to wake his father, he remained there looking at the empty chair while trying with everything inside him not to imagine the day it might never be filled again. As winter settled across Jefferson County, the walks beside the river stopped altogether, although Matthew continued putting on his boots every Saturday morning out of habit before quietly waiting near the barn in case his father felt strong enough to join him. Most mornings, Samuel eventually opened the back door, smiled apologetically, and admitted that he was tired today, promising they would walk again next week, and Matthew always smiled back before telling him there was no hurry, because the river wasn't going anywhere, even though something deep inside him had already begun whispering the truth he refused to accept. The hospital room became the first place where Matthew finally stopped pretending. He sat beside Samuel's bed, holding the same weathered hand that had once guided him across flooded fields, repaired broken fences, and quietly lifted burdens from people who had nowhere else to turn, wishing with everything inside him that love alone could somehow keep another person alive. Samuel slowly opened his eyes, smiled faintly when he saw his son, and after gathering enough strength to speak, quietly asked whether Matthew remembered the mornings they used to walk the river together, causing Matthew to nod through tears as he whispered that he remembered every one of them, and Samuel gently squeezed his son's hand before speaking in slow, careful breaths that demanded all the strength he still possessed, as he quietly said, "If life ever gives you the chance to own land," before stopping to catch his breath, causing Matthew to lean closer as Samuel looked deeply into his son's eyes and continued, "Don't buy the prettiest field." And after another long pause, he softly added, "Buy the one nobody understands," leaving Matthew to lower his head as tears finally escaped despite every effort to hold them back, and before he could answer, Samuel gently tightened his grip one final time and whispered, "Promise me," causing Matthew to close his eyes, nod through the tears, and whisper the only words he could manage, "I promise." It was the last promise Matthew Carter would ever make to his father. The weeks following Samuel Carter's funeral passed with the strange quietness that often settles over a family after everyone else has returned to their own lives, because although neighbors continued stopping by with warm meals, offers to help, and words they genuinely hoped would ease the pain, none of those kindnesses could fill the empty space left behind by a man whose presence had shaped nearly every ordinary moment inside the Carter home. Matthew threw himself into work from sunrise until long after dark because the fields still demanded attention whether a heart was ready or not. Yet there were countless moments throughout each day when his hands continued working while his thoughts quietly searched for someone who was no longer there. Some mornings he found himself turning toward the porch before leaving the house, almost expecting to see Samuel already sitting in his chair with a cup of coffee resting beside him, while other mornings he caught himself looking across the barn before remembering there would never again be another calm voice reminding him to slow down and look more carefully before making a decision. Those small moments hurt far more than the funeral itself, because grief rarely announces its arrival through grand events, choosing instead to appear during ordinary routines that suddenly no longer feel complete. Emily noticed the change long before Matthew admitted it, because she often found him standing silently beside the old river map Samuel had kept folded inside the kitchen drawer for years, tracing the blue line with one finger before quietly returning it to its place without saying a word. And although she wanted desperately to remove the burden he carried, she understood that some sorrows could only be walked through rather than spoken away. So, instead of asking questions, she simply remained beside him, offering the kind of steady presence that asks for nothing while giving everything. Then, one cold February morning, the notice from Jefferson County Bank arrived. Matthew unfolded the letter slowly, already recognizing the property description before he reached the final page, because Samuel had studied those same 320 acres more times than Matthew could remember, often spreading county maps across the kitchen table after supper while quietly explaining how most people judged land too quickly, seeing only the surface while forgetting that the earth beneath every field usually carried a much longer story. Matthew sat motionless for several minutes after reading the auction notice, because the decision resting before him suddenly felt far larger than buying land. It felt like standing at the edge of the last conversation he would ever have with his father. That evening he carried the letter outside and sat alone on the porch, where Samuel's chair still faced the western fields exactly as it always had. And while the winter wind gently rocked the empty chair beside him, Matthew unfolded the auction notice once more before quietly reading every line again, almost hoping the words would somehow change if he looked long enough. They never did, and as darkness slowly settled across the farm, he finally lowered the paper into his lap before whispering into the silence that he wished his father were still there, because for the first time in his life he wasn't sure whether courage and foolishness looked exactly the same. Emily stepped onto the porch a few moments later, carrying 2 cups of coffee, placing one into Matthew's hands before sitting beside him, without asking what was wrong, because she already knew. And after they watched the fields in silence for several minutes, she gently rested her hand over his and quietly asked whether this was the land his father used to talk about. Matthew nodded without taking his eyes from the dark horizon, and after another long silence, she softly asked whether he believed Samuel would still tell him to buy it if he were sitting in the empty chair beside them, causing Matthew to close his eyes for a moment before admitting in a voice almost too quiet to hear that he honestly didn't know anymore. A confession that hurt him more than any words he had spoken since the funeral, because it was the first time he had ever doubted the promise he had made. Emily squeezed his hand gently and looked toward the same empty chair before telling him that she couldn't promise the land would ever become what Samuel believed it could be, and she couldn't promise life would become easier if he raised his hand at the auction, but she could promise one thing with complete certainty. "Whatever you decide tomorrow," she said softly, as Matthew finally looked at her, "you won't carry it alone," causing him to lower his head as tears quietly filled his eyes once again, not because every fear had disappeared, but because he suddenly realized the greatest gift his father had left behind wasn't only a promise about land. It was a family that still knew how to carry heavy things together. The following morning, Matthew walked through the courthouse doors, carrying the same worn leather folder he had studied for weeks. Yet it felt strangely lighter than it had the day before, because, although Samuel was no longer walking beside him, the lessons, the promise, and the quiet strength that had shaped his entire life still were. And when the auctioneer finally unfolded the county map, and asked whether anyone wished to place the opening bid on 320 acres everyone else had already dismissed, the room settled into a silence so complete that every heartbeat seemed louder than the last, until one lonely hand slowly rose above the crowd. Matthew Carter had kept his promise. The deed to the 320 acres arrived less than 2 weeks after the auction, although judging by the conversations drifting through Jefferson County, most people spoke about the purchase as though Matthew Carter had inherited a problem rather than acquired a farm, because nearly everyone who had worked near the Arkansas River long enough believed the same thing, that the land flooded too often, dried too slowly, and demanded far more patience than it could ever repay, leaving Matthew to quietly accept every doubtful smile, every sympathetic handshake, and every warning offered by people who genuinely believed they were trying to save him from a mistake that would follow him for the rest of his life. Matthew never argued with them because he understood something his father had taught him years earlier, that people rarely changed their minds because someone won an argument. Yet they often remembered quiet examples long after they forgot loud opinions, so instead of defending his decision, he simply unlocked the old rusted gate on the first morning, stepped onto the neglected property for the very first time as its owner, and began walking the land in complete silence, while Emily followed a few steps behind, watching her husband study every rise, every shallow depression, every bend in the riverbank, and every patch of dark earth with the patient curiosity of someone greeting an old friend rather than inspecting a failed investment. To everyone else, the farm looked abandoned because broken fences leaned beneath years of neglect. Wild grass reached almost to Matthew's knees. Driftwood still rested in places where the last flood had left it behind, and the weathered remains of an old equipment shed stood crooked against the horizon as though waiting for one final storm to finish what time had already begun. Yet Matthew never once described the property as ruined, because every few minutes he stopped to kneel, gathered a small handful of the rich black soil into his palm, rubbed it slowly between his fingers, and quietly smiled to himself in a way Emily had seen only once before, many years earlier, when Samuel had spread an old county map across the kitchen table and spoken about the river as though it were something to be understood instead of feared. Emily eventually walked over and stood beside him without saying a word, waiting until he slowly opened his hand and allowed the loose soil to fall back onto the ground, before softly asking whether he truly believed this forgotten place could become the farm Samuel had always imagined, causing Matthew to look across the valley for several long moments before gently answering, "I don't know if it'll become the farm he imagined." And after another thoughtful pause, he looked down at the dark earth beneath his boots before quietly adding, "But I know one thing. He would have knelt exactly where I'm kneeling." Emily smiled, not because every doubt had disappeared, but because she finally understood that Matthew hadn't come there searching for certainty. He had come searching for faith, and those two things had never been quite the same. The weeks that followed were filled with the kind of work nobody ever celebrated, because there were no remarkable harvests, no miraculous discoveries, and no dramatic victories waiting just beneath the surface, only long days spent clearing fallen timber, repairing forgotten fence lines, cleaning drainage channels that had been neglected for years, and slowly learning the personality of land everyone else had already given up trying to understand. While every evening Matthew returned home exhausted enough to fall asleep almost before his head touched the pillow, yet each morning he climbed back into the truck before sunrise with the same quiet determination, because somewhere deep inside him he still believed the river was telling a story most people had never stayed long enough to hear. Not everyone admired that determination, because almost every afternoon someone driving past found a reason to stop along the roadside, lean against the fence, and offer another prediction about how long it would be before Matthew admitted the county had been right all along. With one farmer laughing that he hoped Matthew enjoyed raising mosquitoes because they were likely to become his most successful crop, while another shook his head and remarked that buying river-bottom land was about as sensible as planting corn in the middle of the highway, comments Matthew heard as clearly as everyone else. Yet he answered none of them, because Samuel had once told him that land always took longer to answer a question than people did, and Matthew had decided years ago that he trusted the land more. One cool evening after the last tools had been loaded into the truck, Matthew climbed the small rise overlooking the lowest part of the property where the previous flood had deposited its deepest layer of silt, quietly knelt once again, and allowed the dark soil to run slowly through his fingers, while the setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold, and for just a moment he could almost feel another weathered hand gently placing that same rich earth into his own many years earlier, reminding him without a single spoken word that some promises were never carried in memory alone. They were carried one ordinary day at a time. The first seedlings finally pushed through the ground a few weeks later, their bright green leaves standing in quiet defiance against a landscape everyone else had already declared hopeless. And although Matthew, Emily, and the children stood together smiling at the first unmistakable signs of life, none of them noticed the distant line of dark clouds slowly gathering beyond the western hills until a low roll of thunder drifted across the valley, causing Matthew's smile to fade ever so slightly as his eyes settled on the Arkansas River flowing peacefully in the distance, because he knew better than anyone that rivers often looked their calmest just before they reminded people who they really were. For nearly 3 weeks after the first seedlings appeared, the farm seemed almost peaceful because gentle sunshine settled across the valley each morning. The young crop grew a little taller every day, and even the neighbors who still doubted Matthew's decision gradually stopped slowing their trucks beside the fence because nothing about the little green rows suggested they were growing on the same land everyone had dismissed only a few months earlier. Matthew never celebrated too early, yet there were moments when he caught himself smiling as he walked between the rows, quietly thanking God for every new leaf pushing through the rich black soil, while Emily watched from the edge of the field with a hope she had been almost afraid to feel. Then the rain began. It arrived so gently that almost nobody considered it unusual because spring storms had always been part of life along the Arkansas River, and during the first 2 days the steady showers even seemed welcome, settling the dust and giving the young plants another drink before summer arrived. Yet each evening Matthew found himself walking alone to the riverbank, where he stood silently watching the water creep a little higher against the old sycamore trees, noticing changes so small that most people would have walked straight past them without a second thought. By the 4th morning, the rain still hadn't stopped, and when Matthew stepped outside before sunrise, the familiar smell of wet earth carried something else with it, something Samuel had taught him to notice years earlier, causing him to stand perfectly still for several moments before quietly looking toward the western sky. Emily joined him on the porch, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and gently asked whether something was wrong. But Matthew never took his eyes off the distant river as he answered softly, "There's too much water coming down from upstream," words that sounded almost like a whisper, yet settled heavily between them, because Emily had never heard her husband speak about the river with that kind of concern before. The rain continued through another day and another night until the sound of water striking the farmhouse roof became almost constant. And although the family tried to carry on with ordinary life, everyone found themselves listening for the next roll of thunder a little more carefully than the last. Matthew barely slept, making quiet trips to the river several times before dawn, each visit ending with the same troubled look on his face as he returned home without saying much, because some fears become harder to explain the closer they come to becoming real. On the 6th morning, the river finally crossed its banks. Matthew reached the lowest field just as muddy water began slipping silently between the first rows of young crops, watching the current spread inch by inch across ground he had worked for months, and although every instinct inside him wanted to stop it, he stood completely still because there are moments when a farmer understands that nature has already made its decision. Emily arrived a few minutes later with the children, stopping beside him without saying a word, as all 4 of them watched the water continue its slow advance until Matthew's young son looked up, held tightly to his father's hand, and asked in a trembling voice, "Dad, does the river hate us?" For several long seconds, Matthew couldn't answer, because every word that came to his mind felt too small for the question, leaving him to gently pull his son close, keep his eyes fixed on the rising water, and quietly whisper, "No, son, I don't believe it does." Even though, for the first time since raising his hand inside the courthouse, he wasn't entirely certain what he believed anymore. By afternoon, the valley had disappeared beneath muddy water. Neighbors gathered along the county bridge, watching the flood spread across the river-bottom farms, and more than one familiar voice quietly wondered whether the young farmer had just lost everything he owned, while Matthew remained standing near the edge of the flooded field until Emily finally slipped her hand into his and gently led him home because there was nothing left to save except each other. The floodwaters lingered far longer than anyone in Jefferson County expected, and although the river eventually returned to its banks, it left behind a silence that settled heavily across the Carter farm, because where neat green rows had stood only days earlier, there now stretched acres of flattened stalks buried beneath layers of tangled debris, driftwood, and mud, forcing Matthew to walk the fields each morning, searching for signs that something, anything, had survived. Yet with every slow step, the truth became harder to escape. Neighbors came to help as they always had, some carrying shovels, others bringing tractors to pull fallen timber from the fields, while a few quietly avoided mentioning the auction altogether, because there are moments when even people who warned you cannot find comfort in being right. Matthew thanked every one of them with the same gentle gratitude he had shown throughout his life, working beside them from sunrise until darkness covered the valley, refusing to surrender to exhaustion, even as every aching muscle reminded him that months of labor had disappeared in less than a single day. The hardest part came after everyone else had gone home, because the farm grew painfully quiet once the engines stopped, leaving only the distant sound of the river moving peacefully, as though nothing had happened. And many evenings Matthew found himself sitting alone on the edge of the damaged field, staring across the ruined ground while trying to understand how something capable of bringing such rich soil could also carry away so much of what people loved. Emily watched those evenings with growing concern because she noticed the changes Matthew tried so hard to hide, noticing that meals often returned untouched, sleep became increasingly difficult, and the kitchen table slowly disappeared beneath rainfall records, county maps, handwritten notes, and old notebooks that had once belonged to Samuel. Until one night, she quietly found him asleep, with his head resting across the table, a pencil still held loosely between his fingers, as though he had been searching for an answer right up until exhaustion finally won. Without waking him, she gently removed the pencil from his hand, folded Samuel's notebook closed, draped a blanket across his shoulders, and stood there for several moments before silent tears filled her eyes, because she suddenly understood that her husband wasn't simply trying to save a farm. He was desperately trying not to fail the promise he had made beside a hospital bed. Several days later, after another long afternoon clearing debris from the lowest field, Matthew wandered into the old equipment shed, searching for a length of chain he thought might still be hanging on the back wall, but instead his eyes settled on a pair of worn leather boots, resting exactly where Samuel had left them months before, their cracked soles still carrying dried river mud from the last season they had walked the fields together. Matthew slowly picked them up, brushed away the dust with trembling hands, and lowered himself onto an old wooden crate, while holding the boots against his chest, and for the first time since his father's funeral, every ounce of strength he had been using to hold himself together quietly slipped away as tears finally came without restraint, filling the empty shed with the kind of grief that only love can leave behind, because there, with nobody watching and nothing left to prove, he finally allowed himself to miss his father with his whole heart. When Matthew finally returned to the house that evening, Emily was waiting on the porch without asking where he had been, because she could already see the answer written across his face, and after they sat together in silence for several minutes listening to the distant river, she gently rested her hand over his before speaking the question she had been carrying alone for weeks, quietly asking, If your father were still here, would he still tell you to keep going? Causing Matthew to lower his eyes toward the fields for what felt like an eternity, because it was the first time anyone had given a voice to the doubt he had been fighting every day, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of the certainty it once had as he admitted, "I don't know anymore," words that hurt him more than the flood itself, because they were the first words he had ever spoken that sounded like surrender. Neither of them noticed that beyond the quiet porch, where the last flood had left its deepest layer of black silt across the lowest field, tiny green shoots had already begun pushing silently through the dark earth once again. Several mornings passed before Matthew found the strength to return to the lowest part of the property, because although the floodwaters had disappeared, the memories they left behind still clung to every acre of the farm, and as he slowly crossed the damaged field carrying nothing more than a shovel and Samuel's old notebook tucked beneath one arm, he wasn't searching for miracles anymore. He simply wanted to understand why the river always seemed capable of taking so much, while still leaving his father so certain that it deserved to be trusted. The ground remained soft beneath his boots, forcing him to walk carefully between scattered branches and piles of driftwood until he reached the same low field where the flood had first swallowed the young crop, and after standing there for several quiet moments, he slowly knelt, scooped up a handful of the dark earth, and allowed it to fall gently through his fingers, causing a memory from childhood to return with such clarity that for an instant it almost felt as though Samuel was kneeling beside him once again, smiling patiently while saying that most people spent their lives remembering what the river took because they never stayed long enough to notice what it always left behind. Matthew looked more carefully, not at the ruined plants, at the soil. The flood had covered the entire field with a fresh layer of rich black silt, deeper than anything he had ever seen before, and as he quietly dug a little farther with the edge of his shovel, he discovered that the earth beneath remained loose, cool, and unbelievably fertile despite everything the river had carried across it, causing him to open Samuel's old notebook, where page after page described flood patterns, soil depth, and observations collected over decades by a man who had never owned this land, yet somehow understood it better than anyone who had. For the first time since the auction, Matthew wasn't looking at failure. He was looking at evidence. The flood hadn't ruined the land. It had renewed it. He sat there for nearly an hour comparing the notebook with the ground beneath him, until the pieces slowly began fitting together, because every major flood Samuel had recorded had been followed by unusually fertile growing seasons, something few farmers had ever noticed, simply because most of them planted somewhere else before the river had finished giving back what it had borrowed. Matthew closed the notebook, looked across the quiet valley, and smiled through tears that no longer came from grief alone, because after months of carrying doubt like a stone inside his chest, he finally understood what his father had seen all those years ago, and although the answer couldn't replace the crop that had already been lost, it gave him something even more valuable. It gave him back his conviction. That afternoon, Emily found him standing alone in the middle of the field with dirt covering both hands and the biggest smile she had seen since before the flood, and although she couldn't yet understand what had changed, she noticed that the heaviness he had been carrying for weeks seemed somehow lighter, prompting her to walk over and quietly ask whether he had finally found what he had been searching for, causing Matthew to look down at the handful of black soil resting in his palm, before softly replying, "No, I think my father found it a long time ago." And after another thoughtful pause, he looked across the valley and gently added, "I'm just finally seeing what he saw." 2 days later, While Matthew was marking out new planting rows across the lowest field, an old pickup slowly pulled to a stop beside the gate, and after sitting inside for several moments, the same farmer who had once laughed that Matthew would end up raising mosquitoes instead of crops climbed quietly from the truck, removed his cap, and walked across the field with the uncertain steps of a man carrying more humility than pride, stopping only a few feet away before asking if Matthew would mind explaining why the soil looked different after the flood, because no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing anymore. Matthew looked from the farmer to the dark earth beneath his boots, smiled gently, and without the slightest trace of bitterness bent down to scoop another handful of river soil into his palm, because some victories become far more beautiful when they arrive without revenge. News traveled through Jefferson County far more quickly than Matthew ever imagined, because farmers have always noticed unusual fields long before newspapers notice unusual people. And as the weeks passed, the neglected river-bottom acres everyone had dismissed began changing in ways that quietly challenged years of accepted wisdom, with the new crop growing taller, stronger, and greener than neighboring fields planted on ground many considered far safer, causing pickup trucks to appear more frequently along the roadside as men who had once driven past without slowing down now found themselves stopping for several minutes at a time, studying the fields in thoughtful silence before continuing on their way with more questions than answers. Matthew never treated the attention any differently than he treated the ridicule, because every morning still began before sunrise, every evening still ended with tired hands, and every visitor received the same warm welcome regardless of what they had once said about his decision, leaving Emily to smile quietly whenever another unfamiliar truck pulled into the yard, because she had long ago realized that her husband measured people by the burdens they carried today rather than the mistakes they made yesterday. Before long, the questions became impossible to ignore, because one farmer wanted to know why the river-bottom soil held moisture longer without becoming waterlogged. Another asked why Matthew planted later than everyone else, while others simply stood listening as he unfolded Samuel's old notebook across the tailgate of his truck, gently explaining flood patterns, soil deposits, and the patient observations collected over decades by a man who had never owned the land, yet somehow understood it better than most people who did. And although every page carried Samuel's handwriting, Matthew never once described the ideas as his father's alone, because he believed the river deserved part of the credit too, quietly reminding anyone willing to listen that the land had been teaching the same lesson all along. People simply hadn't stayed long enough to hear it. One Saturday morning, nearly a dozen neighboring farmers gathered beside the lowest field while Matthew knelt near the edge of a freshly planted row, scooped another handful of the dark earth into his palm, and allowed it to fall slowly between his fingers exactly the way Samuel had done years earlier, explaining that most people judged the river only by the days it flooded, while forgetting to measure everything it returned afterward, and although nobody interrupted him, more than one man lowered his head because they suddenly remembered laughing at the very ground now lying quietly beneath their boots. Among them stood the same farmer who had once joked that Matthew would probably end up raising mosquitoes instead of crops, and after waiting until everyone else had begun walking back toward their trucks, he removed his cap, looked Matthew in the eyes, and quietly admitted, "I laughed at you, and I was wrong," causing Matthew to smile with the same gentle kindness that had carried him through every difficult season before softly answering, "You weren't the only one trying to understand the land. I just happened to keep listening a little longer," words that brought a quiet smile to the older farmer's face, because he realized, perhaps for the first time in many years, that humility grows far more easily when someone refuses to embarrass you for being mistaken. As harvest approached, the fields produced more than anyone had predicted, not because the river had suddenly become gentle, but because Matthew had finally learned how to work with it instead of against it. And while wagons carried healthy crops toward the grain elevator, the conversation throughout Jefferson County slowly changed from wondering how long it would take Matthew Carter to fail into asking whether the forgotten river bottom land might have been the county's greatest opportunity all along. Late one evening, after the last wagon had been unloaded, Matthew walked alone to the highest point overlooking the farm, where the setting sun stretched across rows of healthy crops that now swayed gently in the evening breeze, and after standing there quietly for several moments, he reached into his pocket, removed Samuel's old pocket-knife that he had carried every day since the funeral, and looked toward the river, before smiling through grateful tears, because although his father had never lived to stand on that hill beside him, Matthew somehow knew the promise had finally begun to keep itself. The years passed more quietly after that first harvest because, although the Arkansas River never stopped flooding the low fields, Matthew Carter never stopped walking them. And with each passing season, the county slowly abandoned the old habit of calling the 320 acres worthless, until the land everyone had once laughed at became one of the most respected farms in Jefferson County, not because it never flooded again, but because every flood left behind another reminder that patience often sees value long before certainty ever does. Farmers continued visiting from neighboring counties, some hoping to understand the river a little better, others simply wanting to meet the man who had refused to abandon a promise when almost everyone else believed it had already failed. Yet the thing they remembered most wasn't Matthew's harvest or even the fertile fields stretching across the valley. They remembered the way he welcomed every visitor with the same kindness he had shown before success ever arrived, because whether someone came carrying questions, doubts, or regrets, Matthew somehow made them leave feeling lighter than when they had arrived, quietly proving that the richest harvest growing on the farm had never been corn, soybeans, or wheat. It had always been the character planted there long before the first seed ever touched the soil. Time eventually placed silver in Matthew's hair and slowed the steady strength that had once carried him across flooded fields before sunrise. Yet some habits never left him, because every spring, after the river finally returned to its banks, he still walked the lowest part of the property before beginning another planting season, stopping now and then to kneel beside the fresh black silt exactly as Samuel had done decades earlier, smiling to himself whenever the rich earth slipped slowly through his fingers, because even after all those years, the river never seemed to run out of lessons for people willing to keep listening. One cool spring morning his young grandson insisted on joining him, eagerly following the familiar path toward the river while asking more questions than Matthew could possibly answer before breakfast. And although the little boy had heard countless stories about the great flood that almost destroyed the farm, he had never seen the river quite so full before, causing him to stop suddenly beside his grandfather as the muddy water rolled quietly past and ask whether it would flood the fields again this year. Matthew smiled, not because he knew the answer, because he remembered asking questions just like that many years before. He slowly knelt, scooped a handful of the fresh black soil into his weathered palm, and gently poured it into the boy's much smaller hands before resting one hand on his shoulder and quietly saying, "Don't be afraid of the river," and after allowing the child a few moments to look down at the dark earth resting in his hands, he smiled toward the valley where young crops were already beginning another season before softly adding, "It's bringing tomorrow." The little boy looked down at the soil once more before lifting his eyes toward the fields stretching across the valley, still too young to understand everything his grandfather meant, yet smiling anyway because children often recognize love long before they recognize wisdom, and as they slowly turned toward home together, the morning breeze carried the gentle sound of the river across the farm, while the first sunlight settled over 320 acres that almost nobody had wanted. Looking back now, people sometimes say Matthew Carter proved an entire county wrong. But those who knew him best would quietly tell you something different, because Matthew never spent his life trying to prove anyone wrong. He simply spent it trying to remain faithful to a promise, to a father, to his family, and to a piece of land that asked for patience long before it offered understanding. And perhaps that's why his story still matters today, because every generation eventually finds itself standing before a river of its own, wondering whether to walk away from something difficult or stay long enough to discover what everyone else has overlooked. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly carried burdens without asking for recognition, or if it made you think about a promise you've been trying to keep, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, because those stories deserve to be remembered too. And if you'd like to continue discovering forgotten rural stories like this one, consider subscribing and joining us again here on The Last Acre, where every acre holds a story. Every season leaves a lesson, and sometimes the land remembers what people forget. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. We'll see you in the next story.